Get me a bolt cutter, right now. No one moved. Four men hardened armed, loyal to Franco Ravellini for over a decade, stood frozen at the top of those basement stairs. Because what was down there wasn't business, wasn't a debt, wasn't anything any of them had a protocol for. Franco didn't wait. He took the stairs himself, two at a time, and when he hit the bottom and saw her, chain bleeding, barely breathing, something inside the most feared man in the city didn't just crack. It shattered. If you're new here, subscribe, hit that bell, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go. The message from Marco came in at 11:47 p.m. 3 words, no punctuation, no context. Come to Roberto's. Franco Ravellini read it twice. He was still in his car outside the Caruso sit-down tie, loosened 4 hours of politics behind his eyes, and a low-grade fury sitting in his chest the way it always did after an evening spent watching old men protect small kingdoms. He didn't like wasting movement. He didn't like surprises. And he especially didn't like anything that involved Roberto's house at midnight. He called Marco back. Marco picked up on the first ring. "Don't ask me on the phone," Marco said immediately. "Just come." Franco looked at the phone for a moment after the call ended. In 11 years, Marco had never once said that to him. He drove himself. No driver, no second car. He cut the engine half a block out and walked the rest of the way through the dark with his hands in his coat pockets, reading the stillness of the street the way he'd learned to read rooms. Exits, first threats, second everything else after. Roberto's house sat quiet, front lights off, one unfamiliar car in the driveway. Marco's SUV parked at an angle on the side street, the way a man parks when he's been somewhere longer than he expected and is still deciding what to do about it. Marco was at the side door, and his face, Franco saw it in the 3 seconds before Marco said a word. His face was wrong in a way that had nothing to do with danger and everything to do with something worse than danger. "Roberto's not here," Marco said. "Left 3 days ago, said he was going to cousin Enrico's place down south." He stopped. His jaw worked. "The cleaning crew came in tonight. The rotation we run through all the properties." Another stop. Longer this time. "Marco," Franco said, flat and quiet and final. "There's a woman in the basement," Marco said. "She's chained to the wall." Franco heard the words. He registered them in perfect sequence. And for exactly 2 seconds, he stood completely still. Not from shock, but from the specific kind of stillness that comes right before a man makes a decision that changes the shape of everything that follows. Then he walked inside. The basement stairs were narrow and steep, and Franco took them alone. Nobody followed. He didn't tell them not to, they simply understood. The sound of his footsteps was the only sound in the house. He heard her before he saw her. A breath ragged, shallow, the breath of someone who had learned to keep themselves very, very quiet and hadn't yet unlearned it. And then he came around the utility shelving at the base of the stairs, and he stopped. She was pressed against the far wall, knees drawn up, one wrist secured by a short chain, bolted directly into the floor pipe. She was dressed in professional clothes, or what had been professional clothes, a white blouse and dark slacks, destroyed beyond anything a dry cleaner could touch. Her hair was tangled, matted with something dark at the temple. Her face was all sharpness and hollows. The face of someone the days had been eating alive. But her eyes were open, and they were watching him. Not with fear. That was the thing that stopped him cold. Fear would have been expected. Fear would have made sense. But what he saw in her face was something far worse. It was the look of a person who had already moved past fear, past hope, past the belief that anything that walked down those stairs was going to change her situation for the better. She wasn't afraid of him. She simply didn't believe he mattered. Franco had spent his entire adult life being feared. He had never once in his life felt the impact of being dismissed by someone with absolutely nothing left to lose, and the sensation was so unfamiliar, so wrong, that it moved through him like something physical. He crouched down, slowly, hands visible. "I'm going to get that chain off you," he said. "I'm not going to touch you. I need a bolt cutter. It'll take 2 minutes." He held her gaze. "Can you hear me?" Her lips moved. Once, twice. "Water," she said. One word, barely even that. He turned his head toward the stairs. "Marco." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Water and a bolt cutter. You have 90 seconds. He turned back to her. "My name is Franco," he said. This is a property I own. I did not know you were here. He let that sit for a moment. I need you to know that. Whatever you've been told about this house, whoever told it to you, I didn't know. She looked at him, really looked at him with those empty, exhausted eyes, and he could see the machinery of her mind trying to run the calculation, trying to assess, to weigh, to determine whether this was a new kind of trap or something else entirely. And he understood. He understood completely. He didn't rush her. Marco came down the stairs with a bolt cutter and a water bottle. He handed them to Franco and backed away without being asked. Franco positioned the cutter around the chain link 3 inches from the cuff. "Brace yourself," he said quietly. The chain snapped, her wrist dropped, and he saw in the 2 seconds before she instinctively curled her arm against her chest the marks. Deep grooves worn into the skin above the joint, red and raw and permanent looking. The marks of something that had been pulling against something immovable for a very long time. He held the water bottle toward her without stepping closer. She reached for it with her free hand, and her grip was so weak that the bottle tilted, and he steadied it just 2 fingers at the base, and she either didn't notice or didn't care. She drank the entire thing without stopping. When she finished, her head went back against the wall, and she exhaled long, shuddering from somewhere so deep inside her, it sounded like something being released from a very old pressure. "How long?" he asked. She looked at the wall across from her. 8 days, she said. "Maybe 9. I lost track around day 5. 8 days. Franco didn't let that land on his face. He was very good at not letting things land on his face. But somewhere underneath the discipline, something cold and specific and absolute was assembling itself a verdict about his brother that he had been resisting for 2 years and was now no longer able to postpone. "Are you injured beyond what I can see?" "Ribs," she said. 2, maybe 3. Left side. A pause. "My wrist. I don't know how bad. I'm calling a doctor." "No hospital." Immediate. The vacancy in her eyes was gone. Something sharp and desperate had replaced it sudden as a light switched on. "No hospital. No police. Please." "No police," Franco said. And the matter-of-fact simplicity of the way he said it, no explanation, no justification, just a statement of practical reality seemed to land differently than a reassurance would have. She looked at him. "The doctor I'm calling is mine. He's discreet. He doesn't speak about his patients." He stood. "Can you walk?" She tried to answer and stopped. Tried again. "I don't know." "Okay," he turned. "Marco, I need 2 people down here." Carefully. He heard her voice behind him, still quiet, but something different in it now. Not the emptiness from before, and not fear either. Something closer to the voice of a person who still, despite everything, had questions. "Why are you doing this?" He turned back. She was watching him with that same exhausted calculation, that same stripped-down directness of someone who couldn't afford politeness anymore. "Because you were chained to a pipe in my family's basement," he said. "That's why." "That's the whole answer. That's the whole answer." She held his gaze. And then, not because she trusted him, he knew that, not because she had any reason to, but because she was out of options and her body was making decisions. Her mind hadn't finished approving. She nodded. "Megan," she said. "Megan Turner." Dr. Parisi arrived in 40 minutes and asked 0 questions. This was why Franco paid him. He worked cleanly, efficiently, with the particular competence of a man whose job had long ago stopped involving judgment. 2 cracked ribs confirmed. The wrist hairline fracture and deep tissue damage splinted and wrapped. Dehydration, early signs of malnutrition. 3 separate contusions along her left side that Parisi noted without comment, and Franco noted with a silence so controlled it was its own form of violence. They moved her to an upstairs room. She walked herself, insisted on it, pushed away the offered arm with a firmness that would have been almost funny in its stubbornness if it hadn't been so heartbreaking. She made it to the bed without help and then sat on the edge of it, breathing through her nose, not looking at anyone. Franco stood in the corner of the room while Parisi worked and made calls in a voice too low to carry. He watched her from the corner of his eye the whole time. He couldn't have said exactly why. Only that something about the way she refused to fold, refused to completely surrender to the weakness her body was obviously demanding, made it impossible to look away. When Parisi finished and gathered his things, he paused at the door and met Franco's eyes. A long, specific look. Franco gave him nothing back. Parisi left. Megan lay back against the pillow and stared at the ceiling. Her eyes were open. "The woman's clothes," she said, "in the closet. My associate's wife. I had them brought. Are they going to know I was here?" "No." A pause. "Roberto comes back in 2 days," she said. It wasn't a question. She'd heard him on the phone. "Yes. And I'll be gone by then." "Yes." She turned her head and looked at him directly. "Where am I going?" Franco said nothing for a moment. Outside, somewhere below, he could hear his men moving, controlled, purposeful, doing what he'd instructed them to do without being told twice, which was one of the things he valued most about the people around him. The world was continuing to run. Business was continuing to happen. And in this room, there was a woman looking at him, waiting for an honest answer to a question he didn't have a complete answer to yet. "Somewhere safe," he said. "We'll figure out the details tomorrow." "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It's not." She turned back to the ceiling. He thought she'd stopped. Then, "He told me you were dead," she said. "Roberto. When I asked about this house, who it belonged to, he said the family name didn't mean anything anymore. That the man who ran things was gone." She paused. "He said he was in charge now." The room was very quiet. Franco Ravellini considered those words for exactly as long as they deserved. "Get some sleep," he said. "We'll talk in the morning." He closed the door behind him and stood in the hallway and stood very still and let the full weight of what Roberto had said settle over him, because Roberto had not just kept a woman chained in a basement. Roberto had used that basement to test something, to practice something, to build towards something. And Franco, who had spent 2 years managing his brother the way you manage a wound, you're hoping will heal without surgery, understood with sudden and absolute clarity that he had made the single most dangerous mistake of his career. He had underestimated his own blood. She woke, screaming at 2 a.m. and cut herself off so fast it left the hallway outside her door completely silent for 3 full seconds. Then a knock, quiet and deliberate. "Megan," his voice flat against the door. "You're in the room. Nothing's happened." She heard the tremor in her own exhale. She hated it. "I know," she said. "I know, I'm sorry." "Don't apologize." She listened. She heard him settle, the soft sound of weight shifting against the wall just outside. Just outside. Not coming in. Not leaving. "You don't have to stay," she said. "I know," he said. He stayed. Morning came gray and quiet. Franco was at the table, papers, phone, coffee, the architecture of a man who ran things when she came out of the bedroom. He looked up. He ended his call in under 10 seconds. He poured coffee without asking. And she understood from the deliberateness of the table, the papers, the ordinary morning shape of it, that he was trying to give her something to walk into that wasn't a crisis. She sat across from him. Not beside him. Across. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Ask." "Your brother." She kept her eyes on the coffee. "How much of what he is, how much of that did you know?" Franco set his phone down. He looked at her directly, and she watched something move through his face, something honest and uncomfortable and completely unguarded, which surprised her more than anything else had. "Not enough," he said. "I knew he was dangerous. I knew he pushed lines. I told myself it was manageable." He stopped. "I was wrong." "Were there others?" she asked quietly. "Before me." The silence that followed was not the silence of a man who didn't have an answer. Megan set her coffee down. "What happens to him?" she said. "That's not your concern." "I'm making it my concern." Franco looked at her for a long moment. She saw the reassessment happening, saw him revising whatever he'd thought she was going to be in this situation, recategorizing her, and she held his gaze steady, because she had spent 9 days being defined entirely by what had been done to her, and she was finished with that. She was finished. "He'll be handled," Franco said. "That's not an answer." "Right now," he said carefully, "it's the only one I have." She looked at him. He looked at her. And then Megan Turner picked up her coffee and she said, "I was a medical consultant, crisis response systems for hospital networks. I was 2 blocks from here for a meeting when Roberto approached me." She paused. "I want you to know who I was before this. Before your brother decided I was something he could just..." She stopped. Her jaw tightened. "I want you to know that." "I know," Franco said. "You don't," she said. "Not yet." She set the mug down. "I need a phone. My sister has been missing me for 9 days." I need her to know I'm alive." Without a word, Franco reached into his jacket and placed his phone on the table between them. She looked at it. She looked at him. And for one unguarded second, one moment where the control slipped and everything underneath it was visible, her face showed exactly what 9 days of absolute powerlessness does to a person, and exactly what it felt like to be handed something as simple and enormous as a phone. Franco looked away, not from discomfort, from respect. Megan picked up the phone, and for the first time since she'd been taken for the first time in 9 days, her hands were completely, utterly still. The call with her sister lasted 11 minutes. Franco knew because he stood outside the room and didn't move for all 11 of them, listening not to the words. The walls were thick enough that he couldn't make out words, but to the sound of Megan's voice moving through registers he hadn't heard yet. The first 2 minutes were low and controlled the voice of someone delivering information, carefully managing another person's reaction from a distance. Then it broke. Not loudly, she wasn't a loud person, he was already learning that. But he heard it happen, heard the specific moment when the control gave out and something raw came through, and he pressed his back against the wall and looked at the ceiling and gave her the only thing he actually could give her right now, which was the pretense of privacy. When she came back out, her eyes were red, but her face was composed. She set his phone on the table between them and sat down and folded her hands and looked at him. "She wants to come here," Megan said. "That can't happen. I told her that." "Good. I told her I was safe." She paused on the word, examined it. "I don't know if that's true." "It's true," Franco said. "You keep saying things like that." Megan said, "Like they're facts. Like you saying them makes them facts." Franco looked at her steadily. "In this city," he said, "when I say something is true, it becomes true. That's not arrogance, that's just how things work." He picked up his coffee. "You being safe is one of those things." She studied him. She had a way of studying him that he found simultaneously irritating and oddly clarifying, like being read by someone who didn't have any investment in what the answer turned out to be. Most people who looked at Franco Ravellini saw what they wanted to see or what they were afraid to see. Megan Turner looked at him like she was trying to figure out the load-bearing walls. "My sister is going to call the police," Megan said. Franco set his cup down. "I thought you said—" "I told her not to. She agreed." A pause. "For now," she agreed, "for now." Megan met his eyes. "She gave me 72 hours. After that, she goes to the FBI. The word FBI sat in the air between them like something with its own temperature. "Then we have 72 hours to figure out a cleaner solution," Franco said. "There isn't a clean solution," Megan said. "Your brother kidnapped a woman, chained her in a basement for 9 days. There is no clean solution to that. There's only the question of which mess gets made." She tilted her head. "And whether I'm still around to make choices when it does." Franco looked at her for a long moment. "You think I'd hurt you?" "I think you're a man who manages problems," she said evenly. "And right now I'm a problem." "You're not a problem. I'm a witness. You're a woman who was victimized in a property connected to my family name," Franco said, and his voice was measured, but there was something underneath it that had edges. "Hurting you doesn't solve anything for me. It creates 10 new problems for everyone it solves." He leaned forward slightly. "I don't run my operation that way. Your brother does." The silence that followed was the loudest thing that had happened in the room all morning. Franco sat back. His jaw was tight. She watched him absorb that, watched him choose not to deflect it, not to argue it, watched him simply take it the way a man takes a hit he knows he deserved. "Yes," he said, "my brother does." Marco came in at 10 with news Franco had been expecting and news he hadn't. The expected part, Roberto's phone was pinging towers about 400 miles south, consistent with the cousin Enrico story. He wasn't rushing back. He felt safe. That was useful. The unexpected part, one of Marco's contacts at the docks had flagged something. A container that had cleared customs 3 weeks ago under a logistics company that technically existed but practically didn't. A shell thin as paper, the kind of arrangement Franco recognized because he'd built similar ones himself for different purposes. The container had been logged to a warehouse on the east side, 2 blocks from Roberto's house. Franco read the manifest summary. Marco slid across the table and kept his face neutral the entire time. which cost him more than it usually did. How many, he said. Marco's voice was very quiet. The manifest says industrial equipment, but the weight discrepancies. He stopped. How many, Marco? Could be anywhere from 4 to 8, based on the numbers. Marco looked at the table. It wasn't just her Franco. Franco folded the paper, set it flat on the table, and for exactly 5 seconds, he sat completely motionless, which was a thing he did when the anger was large enough that it needed to be contained before anything else could happen. Megan, who had been sitting across the room with Parisi's instructions in her lap, looked up. She read his face, or what wasn't on his face, and something changed in her expression. What happened? She said. Nothing that concerns you right now. You said I wasn't a problem, she said. You said you were going to be straight with me. She put the paper down. What happened? Franco looked at Marco. Marco looked at the window. My brother's activities, Franco said carefully, were broader than I understood. She went very still. How much broader? I don't know yet. Franco, his name in her mouth with a weight she hadn't used before. How much broader? He told her. Not everything, not the manifest details, not the numbers, but enough. Enough that her face went through 5 different things in the space of about 10 seconds, and then settled into something very cold and very focused, like a person who has just received information that turns grief into purpose. You have to go to the warehouse, she said. I know. All right, then. Today. I know Megan. If there are women in that container who have been there as long as I... She stopped, pressed her lips together, started again. Every hour matters. You understand that. You understand what... Her voice cracked on the last word, and she stopped and looked at the ceiling and breathed, and when she looked back at him, her eyes were dry, but the cold in them was different now. It wasn't detachment. It was something that had decided. I'm going with you, she said. No. I'm a medical consultant. If those women need, absolutely not. Franco, you have 2 cracked ribs, a fractured wrist, and you've been awake for approximately 14 hours after 9 days of captivity, he said, and his voice came out harder than he intended, because the image her words put in his head, Megan at that warehouse, Megan in any proximity to anything his brother had built, was not something he was able to process calmly. You are not going anywhere near that warehouse. She stared at him. He stared back, and he watched her calculate, watched her weigh the argument she could measure it against the reality of her body, against the ribs that made every full breath a negotiation, and then watched her slowly and furiously let it go. Then tell me what you find, she said. Everything, not a summary, everything. Okay, he said. I mean it. I know you mean it, he said. I'll tell you everything. She held his gaze for another 3 seconds. Then she picked up Parisi's instructions and went back to reading them with the deliberate composure of someone who had learned, probably very young, that sometimes the only power available to you was the power of not visibly falling apart. Franco took 6 men to the warehouse. He took Marco and he took Sal, who was the most competent person he had ever employed, and he took 4 others whose specific value was that they were large and fast and didn't ask questions before a situation was explained to them. He didn't take a weapon. He never carried when he was going somewhere he might have to make a decision. The presence of a gun he'd learned early made men make faster decisions than the situation sometimes warranted. And Franco had built his reputation on making precisely the right decision at precisely the right moment, not merely a fast one. The warehouse was locked with a system that took Sal 4 minutes to defeat, which told Franco that Roberto had either underestimated the likelihood of discovery or, and this was worse, had been so confident in his brother's deliberate ignorance that he hadn't bothered to protect himself from it. What was inside the warehouse was something that Franco Ravellini, who had been part of the underworld of this city since he was 19 years old, had never in his life been directly confronted with. He had always maintained a specific line, not out of sentimentality, out of the cold structural understanding that certain lines once crossed could not be uncrossed, that certain businesses attached themselves to your name like a disease and changed the nature of every other thing you'd built. Roberto had crossed that line so far that the crossing was barely visible from where he was standing. 3 women. Not 8, not 4, 3, which was both a relief and its own specific agony. It's all alive. but all in varying states of what Megan had been in when Franco found her, the dehydration, the hollowness, the eyes that had stopped hoping. Franco made calls, fast, efficient, precise calls. He had a network, not the kind he was proud of, not the kind he'd built for moments like this, but a network that included people who could move quietly and care for people who needed to disappear into safety rather than into a system that would ask too many questions. He stood outside while his men worked and called a number he hadn't dialed in 2 years. It rang 4 times. "I was wondering," said the voice on the other end, "when you were going to call me about your brother." Franco went very still. "You knew." "I heard things," said Father Domingo, because that was who it was, the man who ran the only actual shelter network in the city that Franco trusted to stay quiet and stay clean, the man who had buried 4 of Franco's men and said mass at his mother's funeral, and somehow inexplicably remained a person Franco believed in. "I didn't know the scale of it. I suspected Roberto was involved in something bad." A pause. "I should have said something." "Yes," Franco said. "You should have. So should you about many things." A beat of silence. "How many?" "3 that I've found. There may be more. I need your network." "You have it. Send them to Sister Catherine's. She'll ask nothing and say nothing." Another pause. "Franco, this ends with Roberto, whatever it takes." "I know," Franco said. Because you have been protecting that boy for 10 years out of loyalty to your mother's memory. And I am telling you, as the man who said the rites at her grave, she would not want this. She would not want you carrying this." Franco stood in the dark outside the warehouse with his phone pressed to his ear and said nothing for long enough that Father Domingo made a soft sound on the other end. "I know," Franco said again, but differently this time. He came back to the house at 3 in the afternoon. Megan was awake. He hadn't expected her to sleep, had known she wouldn't, and she was at the table with his laptop open and a page of notes beside it, and he stopped in the doorway and looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them spoke for a moment. 3, he said, "all alive, all being taken care of." She exhaled, long and slow, and it sounded like something she'd been holding since the morning. "What condition?" "Similar to yours, maybe slightly better." The timeline was shorter. He sat down. He put both hands flat on the table because he needed to feel something solid. "Roberto's been running this for at least a year, probably longer, using properties connected to the family name, mine, as infrastructure." "He used your name," Megan said. Not a question. "He used everything I built," Franco said, and the flatness of it was more damning than volume would have been. "Every layer of protection I created to keep my business running quietly, the shell companies, the logistics arrangements, the relationships with people who don't ask questions, he used all of it, and I let him, because I told myself he was manageable." Megan looked at him. "You didn't know what he was using it for?" "I didn't look," Franco said. "There's a difference." She was quiet for a moment. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you asked me to tell you everything." "That's not the only reason." He looked at her. She was right. She was disconcertingly, consistently right about things he hadn't decided to say out loud yet. "Because," he said slowly, "you are the only person in this building right now who has absolutely no reason to tell me what I want to hear. And I find that—" He stopped. "I find that useful." Something shifted in her face. Not softness. She wasn't ready for softness, and he didn't expect it, but something like the acknowledgement of a person who has been seen accurately for the first time in a long time. "Your brother gets back in 2 days, she said. "Yes." "What's the plan?" "I'm working on it." "That means you have a plan and you're deciding whether to tell me." Franco almost laughed. It wasn't a laughing moment, but the almost was real. "It means," he said, "that the plan involves variables I'm still calculating." "Does the plan keep him from hurting anyone else?" "Yes." "Does it keep him from hurting me?" "Yes." "Does it involve you doing something you can't come back from?" He looked at her. The question surprised him, not its content, but the fact that she'd asked it. The fact that she cared about the answer in a direction he hadn't expected. "Probably," he said. She nodded, once. And then she turned back to the laptop and said, "I've been looking at the legal structure of the shell companies, the logistics arrangements. If Roberto's been operating under your name without your knowledge, there might be a way to create documented evidence of that separation, protect you legally while still, Megan, I'm trying to help. I know you are. Because you helped me, she said, and her voice was steady, but he heard the thing underneath the steadiness, the thing she was working very hard to keep contained. And I'm not good at owing people things. I'm not good at being the person who needs saving. So she stopped. I need to be useful. I need to do something. And can you understand that? He looked at her, this woman who had been chained to a floor 6 days ago and was now sitting at his table, trying to build him a legal defense. And he felt something he hadn't felt in so long, he barely recognized it. Something that wasn't strategy and wasn't calculation and wasn't any of the things he was supposed to feel. Yes, he said, I can understand that. Then let me help. He pulled a chair out and sat beside her, not across from her, this time beside her, and leaned forward to look at the screen. She didn't move away. He noticed that. He noticed it the way he noticed things that mattered. The logistics company, he said. Show me what you found. And she did. For the next 2 hours, they sat at that table and she showed him the paper trails she'd found, and he explained the structures he hadn't built and the ones he had. And somewhere in the middle of it, Marco came in, looked at the two of them sitting shoulder to shoulder over a laptop, and quietly backed out of the room without saying a word. At some point, Franco couldn't have said exactly when Megan's voice started to slow. He glanced at her and her eyes were still sharp, but her shoulders had dropped and the hand holding the pen was losing its certainty. You need to sleep, he said. I'm fine. You've been up since 3 a.m. and you have 2 broken ribs. I know how many ribs I have. Megan, she put the pen down. She looked at the table for a moment, and then she said very quietly, almost to herself more than to him, what if I fall asleep and when I wake up it starts again? He didn't say it won't. He didn't say you're safe. He'd said both those things before and he understood they weren't the problem. The problem wasn't on logic, it was the body's memory, the way certain experiences rewrote your nervous system's understanding of what sleep meant and what darkness meant and what silence meant. I'll be here, he said. I'll be in this room. If anything changes, anything at all, you'll know before you've been asleep 5 minutes. She looked at him, searching his face with that same relentless honesty that he was coming to expect from her. You don't sleep, she said. Not much, he said. Not lately. She held his gaze for one more moment. Then she stood up. Slowly he saw the ribs in the careful way she rose and she walked toward the bedroom and stopped at the door. Franco, she said without turning around. Yeah, whatever you're planning to do with Roberto. A pause. Make sure it sticks. He watched the door close behind her. He sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling and thought about Roberto coming home in 48 hours with that easy smile, that practiced warmth, that complete and fundamental belief that his brother would always in the end look the other way. He thought about 3 women in a warehouse. He thought about Megan's wrist. He thought about the way she'd said, make sure it sticks, like she was talking about policy, not vengeance, like she'd already accepted the reality of who he was and what he was capable of, and had simply decided to be on his side. He picked up his phone, dialed a number he'd been putting off for 48 hours. It rang twice. We need to talk about Roberto, he said, tonight. The voice on the other end was quiet for exactly 1 second. Then I've been waiting for this call for 6 months, Franco. He closed his eyes briefly. 6 months. His brother had been doing this for at least 6 months, and someone Franco trusted had known and waited and said nothing. And in the morning, he was going to have to decide what to do about that too. The problems multiplied. They always did. That was the nature of the life he'd built. Pull one thread, and 3 more came loose. And the only thing that kept the whole structure from collapsing was the absolute unconditional certainty that he would handle every single one of them. He stood up, walked to the window, stood in the dark and looked at the city he ran and thought about all the things running it had cost him. From behind the bedroom door, nothing. Silence. She was sleeping. Good, he thought. Sleep. Because tomorrow, everything changes. She found the photograph by accident. It was early morning, earlier than Franco had expected her to be. Up and she'd gone looking for more paper, because the notes from the night before had filled every margin of what she had, and the drawer she opened wasn't the one she'd intended. It was a narrow drawer on the left side of the desk, and it held exactly 3 things: a pen, a folded utility bill with Roberto's name on it, and a photograph. She almost closed the drawer without looking. Almost. The photograph was old 10, maybe 12 years, and it showed two young men at what looked like a family dinner, shoulders touching the younger one mid-laugh, and the older one looking at him sideways with an expression that Megan recognized with a jolt in her chest because she had a sister and she knew exactly what that expression was. It was the look of someone who thought the person next to them was going to be okay, who believed it completely, who had not yet been given any reason not to. She was still holding it when Franco came in. He saw it immediately. He didn't say anything for a moment, just crossed the room, took it from her hand without asking, looked at it for exactly 2 seconds, and put it face down on the desk. "How old were you?" she asked. 26. He moved past her toward the coffee. "Roberto was 18. You looked at him like he was the most important thing in the room." Franco poured his coffee. His back was to her. "He was," he said. "Then." The single word then landed in the room like a door closing. Megan sat down. She picked up her pen. She looked at her notes, and then she looked at Franco's back, and she said, "The man you called last night, the one who said he'd been waiting 6 months. Who was that?" Franco turned around. His expression didn't change, but something behind it did a quick internal adjustment, the look of a man deciding in real time how much of the truth served the situation. "His name is Caruso," Franco said. "Dominic Caruso. I was at a sit-down with his father the night Marco called me." Megan set the pen down. "As in the Caruso family?" "Yes." "The family your brother was supposedly negotiating with?" "Yes." "And Dominic Caruso knew about Roberto's operation for 6 months and didn't tell you?" "Also yes." She looked at him steadily. "So either Dominic Caruso was complicit in what your brother was doing, or he was using the information as leverage over you, or..." She stopped. "Or he was waiting to see how long it would take you to figure it out yourself." Franco looked at her with an expression that she was starting to learn meant she'd just said something he had already concluded, but hadn't expected her to reach so quickly. It wasn't quite respect. It was something more surprise than respect, something that hadn't fully decided yet what it was. "All three are possible," he said. "I spent most of last night figuring out which one. And I think it's the third one," he said. "I think he was testing whether I'd look or whether I'd keep not looking. Whether I was the man I claimed to be, or whether I was the man my brother was counting on me to be. That's a dangerous game. This is a dangerous city." "So what did you tell him?" "I told him we'd meet tonight. Neutral ground." He paused. "I told him Roberto would be handled before the weekend, and that if he had information he'd been sitting on for 6 months, he should bring all of it to the table, or I'd consider his silence a position." Megan absorbed this. "And if his silence was a position, if he was actually working with Roberto, then the meeting becomes a different kind of meeting," Franco said simply. She looked at him for a long moment. She understood what that meant. She understood it without ambiguity, without the comfortable softening of metaphor, and she sat with that understanding, with the reality of who this man was and what his world ran on, and made her decision about it the way she made all her decisions now, with the stripped-down clarity that 9 days in a basement had given her and that she suspected was never going to entirely go away. "Be careful," she said. He looked at her, just looked at her, like the words had landed in an unexpected place. "I'm always careful," he said. "No," she said quietly. "You're always controlled. That's different." Roberto called at noon. Franco was standing in the kitchen when his phone lit up with his brother's name, and the kitchen went so quiet that Megan, who was across the room, looked up without being told anything. Franco picked up. "Hey," he said. His voice was perfect, warm, easy, completely unaltered. Megan watched him transform into something she hadn't seen before. Not coldness, not calculation, but a kind of fluid normalcy that was more frightening than either. He became, in an instant, the version of himself his brother expected. "Yeah, I've been at the East Side property a couple times this week. One of the pipes in the utility room needed looking at." A pause. He listened. He smiled, actually smiled, and it reached his eyes, which was the terrifying part. "No, everything's fine. Marco handled it." Another pause. "Yeah, see you Friday. Bring something for dinner. I'll be at the house." He ended the call. The kitchen was very quiet. "He believed you," Megan said. "He always believes me," Franco said. The smile was completely gone. Because I've never given him a reason not to. He set the phone down. That ends Friday. Megan looked at the phone on the table between them. He sounded normal, she said. When he talked to me before, he sounded normal too, for about an hour. Franco said nothing. I keep thinking, she said, that I should have known, that there was something I missed, some signal. She shook her head, but there wasn't. He was just, she stopped. Practiced, Franco said quietly. Yes. She looked up. Have you ever thought about how long he's been practicing on who? The question hit Franco somewhere specific and visible. She saw it in the brief tightening around his eyes, the fractional pause before his next breath. This was the question he hadn't let himself ask completely yet. She'd asked it without meaning to wound him, and she watched him absorb the wound anyway, because some questions did that regardless of intent. Every hour since yesterday, he said. Suyim. Marco came in at 2 with the thing that changed at everything. He came in faster than Marco usually moved, which itself was information, and he had his phone in his hand, and his face was doing the same thing it had done outside Roberto's house 3 nights ago, that particular expression of a man whose model of the world had just been structurally revised. Roberto's not coming Friday, Marco said. Franco went still. What? He called Sal 20 minutes ago. Changed the timeline. Marco put the phone on the table. He's coming tonight. The room recalibrated in real time. Megan felt the shift in atmospheric pressure, the way you felt weather changing, that specific electricity of a situation accelerating beyond its planned speed. She looked at Franco, and she saw something she hadn't seen on his face before. Not panic, she didn't think Franco was capable of conventional panic, but a rapid, visible recalculation. The look of a chess player whose opponent has just moved a piece 3 turns early. Why, Franco said, one word, flat. He didn't say, just said he was wrapping up early and would be back by 9. Marco's jaw was tight. Franco, if he comes here, he won't find her here, Franco said immediately. He looked at Megan. You're moving, right now. Where, she said. Safe house on the north side. Marco knows it. No connection to Roberto, no connection to any property he's ever touched. He was already standing. Parisi can meet you there. Your notes, the laptop, take everything. And you, she said, I'll be here when Roberto arrives. He said it with the same flat certainty. He said everything, and she hated it, hated the way his certainty made arguing feel like bringing a flashlight to a gunfight. That's not the plan, she said. The plan changed. Franco. Megan. He looked at her directly and she stopped because his voice had a quality in it she hadn't heard before. Not command, not dismissal, but something rawer than either. I need to know you're not in this building when he walks through the door. I need that one thing to be certain before I can handle everything else. Can you give me that? She looked at him. She thought about saying no. She thought about every argument she had against walking out of this house and leaving him to face his brother alone with a plan that now had 47 fewer hours to develop than it was supposed to have. She thought about the photograph in the drawer, Franco at 26 looking at his brother like he was the most important thing in the room. You can't protect them, she said. I know you know that, but I need to know that you know it. His face did something complicated. I'm not trying to protect him. You've been protecting him for 10 years. Father Domingo said it. You said it yourself. I mean, that's over. Said Megan. His voice broke slightly on her name, just slightly, just one fracture in the control gone so fast she almost missed it. Please go with Marco. She stood up. She gathered the notes and the laptop, and she did not look at the drawer with the photograph in it. At the door, she stopped. Dominic Caruso, she said, tonight. Don't go to that meeting until Roberto is handled. One problem at a time. I know how to run an operation. I know you do, she said. I'm saying it anyway. She left with Marco. She didn't look back. She told herself that not looking back was a practical decision, not an emotional one, and she almost believed it. Roberto Ravellini arrived at 8:47, 12 minutes early, which Franco had already anticipated, because Roberto had always done things 12 minutes early. When he was feeling confident, it was a tell their father had identified when Roberto was 15, and Franco had never forgotten it. He came in through the front door with a travel bag over one shoulder and a bottle of wine in his hand, and his smile was exactly what it always was, open, Warm, the smile of a man who genuinely enjoyed being alive, which was maybe the most disturbing thing about him. "You're here early," Franco said. He was at the table, papers in front of him, coffee in hand, the architecture of a normal evening. Roads were clear. Roberto set the wine on the counter. "Where's everybody? Marco's car isn't out front." "I gave them the night, thought we'd catch up." Franco gestured at the chair across from him. "Sit down." Roberto sat. He looked comfortable. He looked, Franco thought, like a man who had no idea that the room he'd just walked into was the most dangerous room he'd ever been in. "You look tired," Roberto said. "I've had a busy week." "The Caruso thing's still dragging." "Caruso's fine," Franco said. He put his coffee down. He folded his hands on the table, and he looked at his brother. Really looked at him, the way he'd been avoiding doing for years, because looking too closely at Roberto meant seeing things he'd made the sustained and deliberate choice not to see, and he let himself see it now. The ease, the performance of ease, the practiced warmth with nothing underneath it that matched. "I went into the basement," Franco said. Roberto's smile didn't change. That was the thing, it didn't change, and it should have, even fractionally, even for a half second. Any innocent man hearing that sentence would have shown something: confusion, a question, the natural blankness of someone processing unexpected information. Roberto showed nothing. The smile held like it was bolted in place, which meant he'd prepared for this. "Oh yeah," Roberto said. "The pipe." "There was a woman chained to the wall," Franco said. The smile broke. Finally it broke, not into guilt, not into fear, but into something Franco hadn't expected: calculation. His brother was calculating right there in front of him, openly, the way he calculated in the privacy of his own head, the careful construction of the next move. "Franco," he started. "Don't," Franco said, quietly, completely. The single word filled the room like water filling a closed container. "Don't explain. Don't construct. Don't give me the version you worked out in the car on the drive up." Roberto's mouth closed. 8 days, Franco said. "Her name is Megan Turner, medical consultant, 34 years old. You took her off the street 2 blocks from here after a professional meeting because she was available and convenient." He kept his voice level. He was proud of that, proud of the levelness, because underneath it was something that had been building for 2 years and wanted very much to stop being level. And she wasn't the first. Roberto said nothing. "The warehouse on Decker Street," Franco said. "The logistics shell. The 3 women my people moved last night to somewhere you will never find." He leaned forward. "You built all of this inside the structures I created, inside my name, my protection, my relationships with people who owed me enough silence to not ask questions." Roberto looked at the table. Then he looked up, and what was in his face now was something Franco hadn't seen there in 30 years, since they were children, since Roberto was small enough to be afraid of consequences. It was naked fear. Not performed, not constructed. Real. "I can explain the business logic," Roberto started. Franco stood up. He stood up slowly, which was more frightening than doing it fast would have been. "There is no business logic," he said. "There are human beings. There is my name on the infrastructure you used to move them. And there is whatever you think is going to happen in this room right now." "What is going to happen?" Roberto said. His voice was quiet. The fear was still there. "You're going to tell me everything," Franco said. "Every name, every arrangement, every person who knew and said nothing, every property, every shell, every contact." He stood very still. "And then you're going to sit with that, and I'm going to make some calls, and your life as it currently exists is going to stop." "You're my brother," Roberto said. "Yes," Franco said. "I am, which is the only reason this conversation is happening in private, instead of in a room full of people who want you dead for what you've done with their name." He held Roberto's gaze. "Start talking." Roberto talked for 2 hours. Franco listened. He did not interrupt. He sat and he listened, and he let his brother's voice fill the room with the full accounting of everything he'd built: the contacts, the routes, the arrangements, the money that had moved through legitimate structures. Franco had spent 15 years constructing, and he took in every word with the controlled, patient attention of a man who was building a complete picture before he decided what to do with it. At some point, his phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it. Megan. One message. 3 words. He looked at it once and turned the phone face down and went back to listening to Roberto, because this was not the moment for anything except this room and this conversation, and the thing that needed to be completely finished before anything else could begin. When Roberto finally stopped talking, the house was completely silent. "Is that everything?" Franco said. Roberto looked at him. He looked hollowed out, not remorseful, Franco noted. Not genuinely remorseful, but depleted. The way a person looks when they've spent everything they had on a performance and found out at the end that the performance wasn't going to work. "That's everything," Roberto said. Franco nodded once. He stood. He picked up his phone and walked to the window and called Marco and gave him 5 sentences of instruction in a voice so quiet Roberto couldn't hear them. Then he ended the call and turned around. "2 men are coming," he said. "You're going to go with them. You're not going to argue. You're not going to run." He looked at his brother. "Roberto, do you understand me?" Roberto looked at him for a long moment. And Franco would think about this later, would turn it over many times in the days that followed. His brother's face did something unexpected. It relaxed, completely. Like a man who had been holding a very heavy thing for a very long time and had finally, with something approaching relief, been allowed to put it down. "Yeah," Roberto said quietly. "I understand." The men arrived in 12 minutes. Roberto left without a word. Franco stood at the window and watched the car pull away and stood there for a long time after the taillights disappeared. Then he picked up his phone and read Megan's message. 3 words. "Are you okay?" He looked at the question for a moment. He thought about what okay meant and whether it applied and whether a truthful answer was possible or useful or something he was capable of providing at 11 o'clock at night after the longest day of the past decade. He typed back 2 words. "It's done." Her response came in under 30 seconds. "Come tell me." He stood at the window for one more moment. He thought about Father Domingo's voice on the phone. "She would not want you carrying this." He thought about the photograph in the drawer. He thought about Roberto's face in the moment before the car took him away, that strange, exhausted relief. He picked up his keys. It was a 20-minute drive to the Northside safe house. He made it in 14, and he didn't ask himself why he was driving fast, because he already knew. And the knowing was something he wasn't ready to examine in full. Yet he was only ready to drive toward it, toward the woman who had spent 9 days in his brother's basement and come out the other side asking him if he was okay, which was possibly the most unexpected thing anyone had said to him in years. He knocked. She opened the door. She looked at his face and said nothing for a moment, just looked with that same honest, unguarded attention she'd been giving him since the morning she walked out of the basement on her own 2 feet. "He's gone," she said. "He's gone." She stepped back. He came inside. She handed him a coffee that was still hot, which meant she'd made it recently, which meant she'd been listening for his car. He sat down. She sat across from him. The table between them was small enough that they were closer than they'd been at Roberto's, and neither of them moved to change that. "Dominic Caruso," she said. Tomorrow, he confirmed. "And the 3 women from the warehouse, Father Domingo's people, they're being cared for." He paused. "I want Parisi to check in with them next week," quietly. She looked at him. "You're going to do it through me," she said. "The medical follow-up. You want me to coordinate it." He hadn't said that. He'd been thinking it since yesterday, the kernel of an idea about what Megan's particular skills made possible in the aftermath of all this, but he hadn't said it. "Only if you want to," he said. She was quiet for a moment. He watched her think, watched her weigh the world she was being asked to re-enter, and the shape it had now against the shape it had before. "I want to," she said. Franco nodded. He drank the coffee. It was good she'd made it the way he made it, which meant she'd been paying attention, which meant she noticed things the way he noticed things, quietly and without announcement. "Franco," she said. "Yeah. You called me brave this morning. I don't think you know what you're talking about." She looked at the table. "I'm terrified every hour. I'm terrified right now. She stopped. "I don't stop moving. That's not bravery. That's exactly what bravery is," he said. She looked up. He looked back. And in the quiet of that room, in the particular silence that follows the end of something enormous, something shifted between them. Not dramatically, not with any of the language of the dramatic, but with the quiet, irrevocable certainty of a door opening that had been closed for a very long time. Neither of them named it. They didn't need to. Not yet. Dominic Caruso was 31 years old and had been running the eastern half of his family's operations since his father's stroke 18 months ago, which meant he was either very good or very lucky. And Franco had learned long ago that those two things looked identical until the moment they didn't. They met at a restaurant that belonged to neither of them, neutral ground the way Franco had specified, and Dominic was already there when Franco arrived, which told him something. A man who arrives first to a meeting he didn't choose is either trying to establish control or trying to demonstrate he has nothing to hide. Franco sat down across from him and spent the first 30 seconds of silence figuring out which one it was. "You handled Roberto fast," Dominic said. "I handle things fast when I have complete information," Franco said. "Which brings us to the reason we're here." Dominic picked up his water glass. He was calm, genuinely calm, not performed calm, and Franco respected the distinction even as it put him on guard. Calm men were harder to read than nervous ones. 6 months, Franco said. "That is what you told me to answer the phone. 6 months you knew." "I knew pieces," Dominic said. "Not the full picture." "What pieces?" "Roberto approached one of my logistics contacts 8 months ago, trying to use a route we'd built for other purposes." Dominic set the glass down. "My contact declined and told me. I had Roberto looked at. What I found was," he paused, "enough to know he was operating something your name was attached to that you hadn't sanctioned. And you sat on it." "Oh, I sat on it," Dominic confirmed. He didn't apologize for it. Franco noted that the absence of apology, the flat ownership of the decision. "Because I needed to know if you knew. You thought I was running it." "I thought it was possible," Dominic said. "Franco, the structures your brother used, they were good, professional. They had your fingerprints on the design, even if not on the execution. I needed 6 months of watching you to be sure you were actually in the dark." The restaurant was quiet around them. Franco kept his hands flat on the table and his voice level. "And what did 6 months of watching me tell you?" Dominic looked at him steadily. "That you were the only person in this city who didn't know what your brother was doing, which is either a failure of intelligence," he let that sit, "or a choice." "It was a failure," Franco said. "I chose not to look closely enough. Those are different things and I know the difference." He leaned forward slightly. "What else did you find in those 6 months?" "Roberto had a partner," Dominic said. The table went very quiet. "Not an operational partner," Dominic continued. "Someone upstream, someone who was providing capital for expansion. Roberto's operation was growing. The warehouse you found wasn't the end of it, it was the beginning. He was 3 months away from scaling in a direction that would have taken it beyond anything you could have quietly dismantled." Franco said nothing. He was processing, running the numbers against everything Roberto had told him the night before. Roberto had not mentioned a partner. In 2 hours of talking, his brother had not once mentioned a partner. "Do you have a name?" Franco said. Dominic reached into his jacket and placed a single folded piece of paper on the table between them. He didn't slide it across, just placed it there and left it for Franco to decide what to do with. Franco unfolded it. He read the name. He read it twice. And then he folded the paper, put it in his pocket and sat very still for a moment while the full architecture of the last 2 years rearranged itself around a single new piece of information. "How confident are you?" he said. "Completely," Dominic said. "We have financial records. 3 transfers, offshore but traceable if you know what you're looking for." He paused. "I wasn't going to bring this to you until I trusted you. Last night you handled your own brother. He stopped. "That told me what I needed to know about who you are." "Who I am," Franco repeated. There was something dry in it, something that wasn't quite humor but wasn't far from it either. "I let this happen in my own organization for 2 years. "You stopped it," Dominic said. "Most men in your position would have found a way to not stop it. Too much disruption, too much exposure." He looked at Franco directly. "You had a woman chained in a basement and you called a doctor instead of a cleanup crew. That's who you are." Franco looked at him for a long moment. "You know about Megan Turner?" "I know she's alive and she's with you," Dominic said. "I don't know more than that, and I don't want to." "Keep it that way." "Agreed." Dominic stood. He extended his hand across the table. "The Caruso family has no interest in the business your brother was running." We have no connection to it, no profit from it, and no desire to be adjacent to it going forward. He held Franco's gaze. What we do have is a significant interest in the stability of this city, and that stability depends on you knowing what you're actually dealing with. Franco shook his hand. The name on that paper, he said, is he protected? Dominic's expression answered the question before his words did. He thinks he is, he said. That's different. Franco sat in his car for 11 minutes after Dominic left. He took the paper out of his pocket and looked at the name again, not because he'd forgotten it, but because he needed to let it become fully real before he decided what to do next. The name on the paper was a man he'd known for 9 years, a man who had sat at his table eating his food, shaken his hand at his mother's funeral. A man he had trusted with the kind of peripheral knowledge that came from proximity, not the core of his operation, but enough. Enough to be useful to someone who wanted to build something inside Franco's walls without Franco knowing. He called Marco. I need everything we have on Vincent Pace, he said. Financial movement to communications, everything from the last 18 months. Marco was quiet for exactly 1 second. Vincent, he said, not a question, just the word with the weight of someone absorbing a significant shock. Everything, Franco said. 12 hours. He ended the call. He drove back to the north side. Megan heard the car and was at the table when he came in, which she'd started doing, positioning herself at the table with something in front of her, something to work on so that she was meeting him as a person engaged in a task rather than a person waiting. He'd noticed it. He'd never commented on it. He respected it the way he respected all the small, precise ways she managed her own dignity. He sat down. He didn't take his jacket off. He put his hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment. There's someone else, he said. She put her pen down. What do you mean? Roberto had a financial partner, someone who was funding expansion. He looked up. Someone I've known for 9 years. She absorbed this. He watched her process it, watched her move through the implications with that quick structural intelligence that kept surprising him in its speed. Someone inside your organization, she said. I'm open. Adjacent to it, close enough to understand the infrastructure. Far enough that I never looked at him as a threat. He paused. His name is Vincent Pace. He ran a legitimate import business that overlapped with some of my logistics arrangements. I vouched for him with 3 separate contacts over the years. He looked at her directly, which means I extended my protection to a man who was using it to fund what Roberto was building. You didn't know, she said. I didn't look, he said. Again, I didn't look. She was quiet for a moment. How many times are you going to take responsibility for what other people chose to do? Until I figure out how I made the conditions that made it possible, he said. The flatness of it was absolute. That's not self-pity, it's analysis. I need to understand the failure completely before I can be sure it doesn't happen again. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said something he hadn't expected. I know a federal prosecutor. The room shifted. His name is Aaron Webb, she said. We worked together 3 years ago on a crisis response protocol for a federal detention facility. He's clean, I mean actually clean, not politically clean. He has a specific interest in trafficking cases and a specific frustration with the amount of evidence that disappears before it gets to him. She held Franco's gaze. If I brought him the financial records, the 3 transfers Caruso found in a warehouse documentation, Roberto's full account of the operation, he could build a case against Vincent Pace that would be airtight, federal, not local. Franco said nothing. Roberto confessed everything to you, Megan continued. I know you recorded it. She watched his face. I know because you're not a man who has a conversation that consequential without documentation. You recorded it. She paused. That recording combined with Webb's access to financial forensics. If I give that to a federal prosecutor, Franco said carefully, it opens doors I cannot close. I know. My entire operation becomes visible in ways that I know, Franco. I'm asking you to make sure Vincent Pace goes to prison, she said. I'm asking you to make sure Roberto goes to prison. I'm asking you to make sure that the 3 women from that warehouse and whatever other women were moved through that system before I got there Get some form of justice that actually lasts. She leaned forward. I'm not asking you to confess to anything. I'm not asking you to be a witness. I'm asking you to give me what you have on them and let Aaron Webb do his job. Franco looked at her. He looked at her for a long time in that way he had of looking at things he was deciding complete unblinking attention. You trust this man, he said. With my life, she said, which given the last 10 days is a statement I don't make lightly. He'll have questions about how you obtained the information. I'll tell him I was a victim of the operation, she said, which is true. I'll tell him I had access to documentation through the investigation of my own case. She paused. Which is also true in a way that doesn't require me to say your name. In a way that doesn't require you to say my name, Franco repeated. Yes. And if he pushes? He won't, she said. Aaron Webb wants pace. He's wanted someone at that level for 2 years. He's not going to push on the provenance of evidence that gives him what he needs. Franco stood up. He walked to the window, his thinking position. She'd learned the window and stood with his back to her for a long moment. She waited. She'd learned to wait for him the way you learn to wait for weather, not passively, but with the specific patience of someone who understood the process had to complete itself. There's a condition, he said finally. Tell me. He turned around. Megan Turner is not in any file. Not as a witness, not as a victim, not as a name connected to this case in any documented way. She recovered from her ordeal privately and did not participate in the investigation. He held her gaze. That's non-negotiable. She stared at him. That protects you, she said. If my name isn't in the file, there's no documented reason for me to have had access to. It protects you, he said. If your name is in a federal trafficking case, it follows you professionally, personally, every background check, every credential review, every new client who looks you up, it's there. Everything you were before Roberto gets permanently attached to what Roberto did to you. He paused. You said you needed to remember who you were before the basement. I'm trying to make that possible. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that he came back to the table and sat down and waited. Okay, she said finally. Her voice was not entirely steady. Okay, that condition is accepted. Then call Aaron Webb, Franco said. She called Webb from the next room. Franco stayed at the table and did not listen because she deserved the same privacy he'd given her with her sister, and because he had enough to do with his own phone and the 12 hours he'd given Marco that were now down to 8. Marco delivered at the 7-hour mark, financial records, movement logs, 3 intercepted communications that required no interpretation. Vincent Pace's involvement was not ambiguous. It was not deniable. It was the kind of documentation that made prosecutors grateful and defense attorneys very quiet. Franco looked at everything Marco brought and felt the particular cold clarity of a man who has stopped hoping he's wrong and started deciding what to do about being right. Vincent Pace had sat at his mother's funeral. He had shaken Franco's hand over her grave. And then he had gone home and wired money to Roberto Ravellini to build something that used the grief of that family, the protection of that name as cover. Where is he now? Franco said. Hotel downtown, Marco said. He doesn't know we're looking at him. He went out for dinner at 8, came back at 10. His lights went off at 11. Marco paused. He's comfortable, Franco. Not for long, Franco said. Marco hesitated, just barely. What do you want to do? Nothing tonight, Franco said. Megan is building something with a federal contact. If that goes the way it should, Pace gets processed through a system that will put him somewhere permanent. He looked at Marco. What I want personally is not what serves the situation, so we wait. Marco nodded. He understood. One of the things Franco had always valued most about Marco was his ability to understand the difference between what a man wanted and what a situation required. Roberto Bam, Marco said quietly. He asked about you this morning. Franco went still. He asked what? He asked if you were doing okay. Marco said it carefully like something fragile. He said, and this is exact, I made him repeat it. He said, tell Franco I'm sorry, not for getting caught. I know that doesn't matter. Tell him I'm sorry it was his basement. The room was very quiet for a moment. Franco picked up his coffee. It was cold. He drank it anyway. What did you say? I said I'd pass it along, Marco said. Good. Franco set the cup down. That's the right answer. Megan came back out at midnight. She sat down and she looked at him and she said, Webb is in. Franco exhaled. Just once. Just barely. Timeline. He needs 3 days to assemble his team quietly. He wants the financial records delivered through a cutout, an attorney I trust not connected to you. He'll have a federal warrant for Pace's accounts by the end of the week. She paused. He also said, and you need to hear this, he said the Roberto confession recording is the cleanest thing he's seen in 10 years. His words. He said it closes every door Pace's lawyers will try to open. He won't know where it came from. He didn't ask, Megan said. I told you he wouldn't. Franco nodded. He looked at the table, then he looked at her. You did that very efficiently. I've been thinking about it for 2 days, she said, since you told me about the warehouse. You didn't say anything. I didn't have the full picture yet. She met his eyes. I needed Dominic Caruso's information before the plan was complete. Franco looked at her. He thought about the notes she'd been making, the legal structure research, the laptop open at 2 a.m. He thought about the fact that while he'd been managing Roberto and running through logistics and driving to neutral ground restaurants, Megan Turner had been quietly building a federal case in the next room on cracked ribs with a splinted wrist and had waited until the plan was complete before presenting it to him because she understood completely, that a half-formed plan was more dangerous than no plan at all. Megan, he said. What? Who are you? He said, and it wasn't entirely a question. Something crossed her face, something that was almost a smile but stopped short of it, turned into something more private and more complicated. I'm someone who was very good at her job, she said, before your brother decided I was convenient. She looked at the table. I'd like to be that person again. You never stop being that person, Franco said. She looked up. He said it simply without decoration. The way he said things, he meant absolutely. You coordinated crisis response for hospital networks, he said. You walked out of a basement on your own legs. You built a federal case in 72 hours while recovering from a fractured wrist. He paused. That's not someone who stopped being good at her job. That's someone who found out exactly how good she is when everything else is stripped away. She looked at him for a long moment. He watched the thing move through her face, the complicated architecture of a person receiving something true that they haven't let themselves believe yet. You're not what I expected, she said finally. No, he said. I know. When Roberto first said your name, before when I still thought you were, I had an image. The Ravellini name, what it meant. She shook her head slightly. You're not that image. I'm not entirely not that image, he said carefully. I want to be honest with you about that. The things I've built and the way I've built them, those are real. The world I operate in is real. I'm not going to perform better than I am to make this easier. I know, she said. I'm not asking you to. Then what are you asking? The question came out quieter than he'd intended. She looked at him for a moment. Then I'm asking whether this, she gestured at the space between them at the table at the last 4 days condensed into a gesture. Whether this is something that exists past Friday, past the case, past the moment when I can walk out of here and go back to my life. She held his gaze. Or whether it's just what it looks like from outside, a man cleaning up his brother's mess and a woman who happened to be in it. Franco said nothing for a moment. He was aware of the weight of the question, not its emotional weight, though that was considerable, but its structural weight, the way it required honesty that served neither of them practically. The way it was exactly the kind of question Megan Turner asked, because she was a person who had learned at significant cost not to let things go unnamed. It's not a mess cleanup, he said. You know that? I know what I feel, she said. I don't know what you feel. I feel, he stopped, started again. I haven't felt anything this clearly in a very long time, he said. I've been running things for 15 years, and everything I feel goes through a filter. First, does it compromise the operation? Does it create a vulnerability? Does it give someone something to use? And this, he paused, this doesn't go through the filter. It just exists. I don't have a protocol for that. She looked at him. That terrifies you, she said. Yes, he said. Good, she said quietly. It should. He looked at her, and for the first time in 4 days, possibly in years, Franco Ravellini laughed. Just once, just briefly, just a short exhale of sound that broke something open in his chest that he hadn't known was sealed. And Megan Turner on the other side of the table smiled, really smiled, the first time he'd seen it, without something shadowing it, and it transformed her face into something he recognized immediately as what she must have looked like before any of this happened. He wanted to see it again. He decided that clearly and without filtering it. He wanted to see it again. "There's something I need to ask you," he said when the moment settled. "Ask." The three women from the warehouse. The follow-up care, the coordination with Father Domingo's network. "I want to build something more formal. A structure with real funding and real medical support that can handle situations like theirs without requiring everything to flow through informal channels." He looked at her. "I want you to design it." She stared at him. "You want me to design a victim support infrastructure?" "Using someone who knows what those women need from the inside," he said, "and who knows how crisis response systems actually work." He paused. "Funded, quietly structured, cleanly run, under a legitimate medical consulting framework. Your name on the letterhead, not mine." "Why not yours?" "Because my name opens certain doors and closes others," he said. "Yours opens the ones that matter." She was very still for a moment. He watched her thinking, watched her turn it over, check the angles, examined the structure, the way she examined everything. "You're serious," she said. "I'm always serious. This would take months to build properly." "I know. It would require me to stay," she stopped, "to be in proximity to you, to your world." "Yes," he said. He didn't look away. "I know what I'm asking." Well, the question between them was not small, and they both understood that. It was not a question about a job or a structure or a funding arrangement. It was a question about whether Megan Turner, who had every reason to walk away from anything connected to the name Ravellini and never look back, was willing to stay in the orbit of a man she had no business trusting and had somehow, despite everything, begun to trust. She looked at the table. She looked at her splinted wrist. She looked at the notes she'd been making for 4 days, pages of them, filled margins, the evidence of a mind that had refused to stop working even when everything around it was designed to make her stop. "I want a contract," she said. "A real one, legal documented with clearly defined scope and exit clauses." "Of course," he said, "and I want to work from my own office, not yours, not a property connected to you." "Agreed. And if I ever feel that the structure is being used for anything other than what we're building it for, I walk. No conversation, no negotiation. I walk." "Those are reasonable conditions," Franco said. "Franco." She looked up. "I'm not done." "I know," he said. "Keep going. Whatever this is." She gestured again at the space between them. "It goes at my pace, not yours. I'm still putting myself back together. I need you to understand that." "I understand that," he said. "You can't manage me," she said. "The way you manage everything else. I'm not a situation." "No," he said, "you're not." She held his gaze. She was looking for something specific, the thing that would tell her whether he meant it or whether he was saying what the moment required. He let her look. He didn't perform certainty. He just sat there, in the late quiet of a North Side safe house, and let her see him as clearly as she wanted to. "Okay," she said finally. "Okay," he said. She picked up her pen. She pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward her. "Then let's talk about the structure," she said. "Because if we're doing this, I want it done correctly. Not eventually. Now." And Franco Ravellini, who had built an empire on the principle that everything required a plan, leaned forward and looked at the blank page Megan Turner was about to fill and felt something he hadn't felt so long, it took him a moment to identify it. He felt simply like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The paper on that table was going to become something. He didn't know every detail of its shape yet. Neither did she. But they were both still sitting there at 1 in the morning, and the city was quiet outside, and the plan they were building was one that for the first time in 15 years, Franco couldn't see the edge of. He found that he didn't mind. From down the hall, his phone buzzed once. Marco, a single line paste checked out of the hotel at midnight. "We have eyes on him." Franco read it, typed back 3 words. "Don't lose him." Then he put the phone face down on the table and turned his attention back to Megan and the blank page. Everything else could wait an hour. Vincent Pace made his first mistake at 6 in the morning. Marco called Franco at 6:04, and Franco was already awake. He'd slept 3 hours on the safe house couch, which was 3 more than he'd expected, and he picked up on the first ring and listened in without interrupting while Marco told him what Pace had done. Pace had gone to Roberto. Not to Roberto's house, he wasn't that stupid, but to the arrangement Franco's men had put Roberto in the quiet holding situation 2 miles east, that Roberto had agreed to without argument, that Franco had believed Roberto didn't have the means to communicate out of. Pace had a contact inside, someone Franco's people hadn't identified. And at 2 in the morning, 6 hours after Pace checked out of his hotel, he'd made contact with Roberto, and the message intercepted 40 minutes later when Marco's man got to the right phone, was 4 words. Tell them nothing more. Franco read the transcription Marco sent. He read it twice. Then he put the phone down and sat on the edge of the couch in the early morning quiet and thought about the specific texture of being underestimated by a man he'd vouched for across 9 years in 3 separate handshakes. Franco, Megan's voice from the doorway. She was awake. He wasn't surprised he had learned her sleep was light and fractured, that she surfaced at sounds the way a person did when their nervous system had been rewired by prolonged threat. She read his face in the 2 seconds before he said anything. What happened? Pace knows we're moving, he said. He made contact with Roberto. She crossed the room and sat down, not across from him, this time beside him, which she'd never done before, and he registered it without comment because this was not the moment for anything except the problem. How? Someone inside, I don't know who yet. He looked at her. The timeline with Webb just compressed. She was already thinking. He could see it, the rapid internal processing, the same machinery that had built a federal case in 72 hours running at full speed on 4 hours of sleep. Webb's team needs 3 days, she said. We don't have 3 days. No, Quish. Can Webb move faster? That's your call. He's your contact. She picked up her phone. She looked at the time, 6:09, and then she called Aaron Webb anyway. He picked up on the second ring, which told Franco something about the man without needing to meet him. Franco listened to her side of the conversation. It was concise, precise. She gave Webb exactly what he needed and nothing he didn't. And when she ended the call, 2 minutes later, she turned to Franco and said, he can have a warrant by tonight if I get him the financial records before noon. You'll have them by 9, Franco said. He was already texting Marco. There's something else, she said. She said it in the specific tone of someone who has been holding a piece of information and has decided the moment to release it has arrived. I didn't tell you last night because the plan wasn't ready. But when I talked to Webb yesterday, he told me something about Pace. Franco looked at her. Tell me. Webb's been building a separate case for 14 months, a trafficking network operating through legitimate import businesses on the Eastern Seaboard. He had 3 of the companies, but couldn't close the loop on the funding source. She held his gaze. Vincent Pace's import business is the 4th company, the one Webb couldn't find. She paused. Roberto wasn't Pace's first operation. He was the expansion into this city. Pace has been running variations of this for years under different names in 3 different states. The room was very quiet. How many people? Franco said. Webb doesn't have a complete number yet, she said. But he said, and these are his words, that closing Pace would be the single largest result his unit has produced in a decade. Franco stood up. He walked to the window. He stood there with his back to her and breathed and let the full weight of it settle the 9 years. The handshakes, the funeral, the trust he'd extended like a bridge and that a man had used to move terrible things across. And he felt the anger arrive in full, and then he felt it become something else, something colder and more permanent than anger. A decision. Megan, he said without turning around. Yeah, I need you to know something. He turned. What Pace built the part that ran through Roberto, through my infrastructure, that ends completely. Whatever it costs me structurally, whatever exposure it creates, whatever doors it opens that I'd rather keep closed. He looked at her directly. I'm giving Webb everything he needs, not the minimum, everything. She looked at him. That's going to cost you, she said quietly. Yes. Are you prepared for what that means? I've been preparing for it since I walked down those basement stairs, he said. I just didn't know what I was preparing for yet. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded. Once. The particular nod of a person who has asked the question they needed to ask and received the answer they needed to receive. Then let's finish it, she said. The records reached the web at 8:53. Franco's attorney, not his usual one, a woman named Carla Rice, whom Franco trusted precisely because she'd never asked him for anything he wasn't prepared to give, delivered a sealed package to Webb's office in person, said nothing beyond confirming its contents, and left. Franco tracked the timing from his phone, and when Carla confirmed delivery, he put the phone in his pocket and felt something he recognized as the particular relief of a thing set in motion that could not be recalled. Marco called at 10. Pace is moving, Marco said. He's not running. He's going to his office, his import business. We think he's destroying records. Franco thought for approximately 4 seconds. Is Webb's warrant active? Marco checked. 30 seconds. Not yet. Carla says 2 more hours minimum. Then we slow him down, Franco said. How? Call in an anonymous fire safety complaint to the building. Get inspectors there in the next 20 minutes. Pace won't destroy records with city officials in the building. Marco was quiet for a moment, then, that's surprisingly clean. I have my moments, Franco said. The inspectors arrived at Pace's building at 10:18. Pace did not destroy records. He sat in his office and made phone calls, monitored all of them by the wire Webb's team had placed on his communications the moment the financial records confirmed his involvement. And with each call he made, he built the case against himself higher and more solid, the way panicking men always did when they believed they were solving problems and were actually creating new ones. At 12:47, Webb's warrant came through. At 1:15, Vincent Pace was in federal custody. Franco received the confirmation from Webb through Megan, who received it through a text that she read, and then held the phone out to Franco without saying anything. He read it. He handed it back. And neither of them spoke for a moment, because some things, when they finally happen, don't need words layered on top of them. Then Megan said very quietly, "It's done." Almost, Franco said. Roberto. So, Roberto's federal processing took longer because Roberto's situation required the coordination of Caruso's documentation with Webb's existing case structure and the careful threading of Franco's recorded confession through a legal cutout that kept Franco's name out of the chain of custody. It was precise, painstaking work, and it was work that Carla Rice earned every dollar of her fee, performing over 48 hours while Franco and Megan stayed in the Northside safe house and waited. During those 48 hours, certain things happened that would not have happened under different circumstances. Megan's sister Claire came on the second day. She arrived in a car that Franco's people had arranged neutral, unmarked, untraceable, and she came in through the side entrance, and when she saw Megan, she made a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a cry and crossed the room in 3 steps and held her sister with both arms, and Megan, who had maintained her composure through 9 days of captivity and 5 days of crisis management and the complete dismantling of a trafficking operation, pressed her face into her sister's shoulder and shook for approximately 90 seconds and then stopped and straightened and said, "I'm okay. I need you to hear that. I'm actually okay." Franco left the room during this. He went to the kitchen and made coffee he didn't drink and stood at the counter and thought about his mother, which was something he'd been doing in spare moments since Father Domingo had mentioned her on the phone. He thought about what she would have said about the last week, about Roberto, about his own failures of attention, about the woman in the next room who had arrived in his life through the worst door imaginable and was somehow now connected to the best impulse he'd acted on in years. He thought his mother would have been characteristically blunt about all of it and characteristically correct. Claire found him in the kitchen 20 minutes later. She was 31 younger than Megan, with the same directness in her eyes, but more heat in it, less patience for the long strategic read, more immediate. She looked at Franco Rabellini the way a younger sister looks at the man connected to her older sister's worst experience, which was a look Franco felt he had genuinely earned and therefore received without defense. "You found her," Claire said. "It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't accusation. It was a statement being verified." "Yes," Franco said. "And you kept her." She stopped, started again. "She says you kept her safe." "I tried to." "Why?" Same question Megan had asked, different quality to it, raw or less filtered. "Because she was there," Franco said. "Because it was right." He paused. and because the moment I saw her not helping wasn't something I was capable of. Claire looked at him for a long time. Whatever she was looking for, she either found it or decided the looking was sufficient because she nodded once, a tight, conclusive nod, and said, "She's going to need time." "I know." "She doesn't do slow," Claire said. "She's going to move fast and act fine, and you're going to have to watch for the moments when she's not fine and she won't tell you." "I've noticed," Franco said. Something shifted in Claire's face. Not warmth exactly, but the absence of the specific hostility she'd come in with. "She trusts you," Claire said. "That's not something she does quickly or lightly." "I know," Franco said again. Don't make it something she regrets." "I don't intend to." Claire looked at him once more. Then she went back to her sister, and Franco stayed in the kitchen and drank the cold coffee and thought that of all the difficult conversations he'd had in the last week, that one had somehow been the most important. The call from Carla came at 7 on the second evening. Roberto's processing was complete. Federal charges filed, arraignment scheduled, no bail recommended given the scope of the case and the documented flight risk. Webb had personally ensured the filing was airtight, had, according to Carla, described the documentation as the most comprehensive voluntary case construction he'd encountered in his career. "He said one more thing," Carla told Franco. "He said whoever put this together understood how systems actually work. He said it wasn't built like evidence. It was built like architecture." Franco thanked her and ended the call and looked at Megan across the table. "Architecture," he said. She almost smiled. "That's how I think about everything." "I know," he said. "I've noticed." She looked down at the table. At the papers still spread across it, the draft framework for the support structure they'd been building, the outlines and contact lists, and funding models she'd been constructing in the hours between everything else. She picked up a page and looked at it and set it back down. "I need to go home," she said. The words came out simply, without preamble, the way she said things when she'd been turning them over long enough that the edges had worn smooth. "I need to sleep in my own bed. I need to sit in my own kitchen and make coffee the way I make it and be in a space that belongs to me." She looked up. "I need to remember what my life feels like when it's mine." "I know," Franco said. "That's not me walking away from—" She gestured at the papers, at him. "From this, I'm not walking away. I just need to walk back to myself first." "Megan," his voice was quiet, "you don't have to explain." "I want to explain," she said, "because I don't want you to misread it. I've spent enough time in the last week being misread by the situation around me. I want to be clear." She held his gaze. "I'm coming back to the work and to," a pause shorter than she'd intended, "to whatever this is becoming." "Whatever it's becoming," he said, and there was something almost careful in the way he repeated it, careful in the way of a man handling something he didn't want to mishandle. "You don't know how to do this either," she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation offered with something close to tenderness. "No," he said, "I don't." "Okay," she said. "That's actually—" She stopped. "That's actually a relief that you don't." He looked at her. "Why? Because if you did," she said, "it would mean you'd done it before, and I'd rather be the first thing you don't know how to do in a long time than the latest thing you know exactly how to handle." Franco was quiet for a moment. "Then you are categorically unlike anything I've encountered before." "Good," she said. "Remember that." She left at 9. Franco walked her to the car. Marco's car, Marco driving the same route they'd used to bring Claire in, and stood on the pavement while Marco loaded the bags, and Megan stood beside him in the cool evening air, with her arms folded not against the cold, but in the habitual posture of someone still instinctively protecting her ribs. "The framework draft," she said. "I'll have a revised version to you by Thursday." "Take until Friday," he said. "Thursday," she said. He almost smiled. "Thursday." She looked up at him and him. The night was quiet around them, and the city beyond the quiet was doing what cities did, continuing indifferent, its 10,000 simultaneous dramas running without pause. They stood in it together for a moment in the particular stillness of two people who have been through something that doesn't have a clean name and have come out the other side still choosing to face the same direction. "Franco," she said. "Yeah." "The photograph. In the drawer at Roberto's house." She looked at him steadily. "You should take it out of that house before whatever happens to the property happens." She paused. You looked at him like he was the most important thing in the room. That version of him that's worth keeping, even now. He said nothing for a moment. The weight of it landed exactly as she'd intended, precisely without cruelty, with the specific grace of a person who understood that grief and accountability could occupy the same space without canceling each other out. "You're going to make me a better person," he said. It came out lower than he intended. "No," she said. "You're going to do that yourself. I'm just going to notice when you do." She got in the car, the door closed. Franco stood on the pavement and watched the car until the taillights were gone, and then he stood there another moment in the dark and the quiet and breathed. His phone buzzed. Marco from the car. A single line, "She's already working." Laptop opened before we hit the first light. Franco read it. He put the phone in his pocket. He went back inside. The table still had her papers on it. Her handwriting across 3 pages, dense architectural, the handwriting of someone who thought faster than they could write and had developed a personal shorthand to compensate. He stood over it for a moment and looked at the structure she'd built, the victim support framework, the medical consulting model, the funding channels, the contact networks, all of it organized with the precision of someone who had spent years turning chaos into systems. He thought about Dominic Caruso's words. "You had a woman chained in a basement and you called a doctor instead of a cleanup crew. That's who you are." He thought about Father Domingo. "She would not want you carrying this." He thought about Roberto's message relayed through Marco. "Tell him I'm sorry it was his basement." He thought about Megan at the door of the bedroom 4 days ago saying, "Make sure it sticks," like it was policy and not the most personal thing anyone had said to him in years. He sat down at the table. He pulled her papers toward him and read through the framework she'd built and began slowly, carefully in the margins to add the things only he knew. The names, the structures, the channels that didn't exist in any document but existed in his head and in the long memory of the city he'd spent 15 years learning to run. He wrote in the margins of her architecture, and she would read it Thursday, and she would see exactly what he'd added, and she would know, without him saying it, without the performance of it, without any of the language of declaration, that he had taken what she built and put himself inside it. Not as a donor, not as a patron, as a participant. It took him 2 hours. When he finished, he put the papers in order and set them flat on the table and sat back and looked at them. Outside, the city continued. Somewhere across town, Aaron Webb was building the prosecution that would define his unit's decade. Somewhere south, Roberto Ravellini was sitting with what he'd done and what it had cost him. Vincent Pace was in a federal holding cell learning the precise distance between believing you're protected and actually being protected. And Megan Turner was in a car with a laptop open, already building the next thing. Franco Ravellini picked up his phone and called Father Domingo. It rang 3 times. "It's late," Father Domingo said, but not unkindly. "I know," Franco said. "I wanted to tell you it's done." A pause. All of it. All of it. Another pause longer with a texture Franco recognized as the old priest absorbing something he'd been hoping for. "And you," Father Domingo said. "How are you?" Franco thought about the question seriously, which was not something he always did. He thought about the last week, about the basement stairs and the bolt car, Cutter and the woman who looked at him without hope, and then slowly began to look at him differently. About the things he'd built and the things he'd let happen inside them, and the reckoning that came from finally looking directly at the cost of looking away. About a table with papers on it that belonged to 2 people who were between them, making something better out of something that had been only wreckage. "I'm okay," he said. And then, because it was Father Domingo, and because dishonesty in this specific direction had already cost him more than he could measure, "I think I might actually be okay." Father Domingo was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had the warmth of a man who had been waiting a long time to hear exactly those words from exactly this person. "Good," he said. "Come to Mass Sunday. Bring coffee. We'll talk." Franco ended the call. He sat in the quiet for one more moment. Then he stood up, gathered Megan's papers carefully, and put them in the inside pocket of his jacket, close, safe, preserved, and he turned off the light and walked out of the room. The city was still running. The work was still running. The thing between him and Megan Turner was still running, undefined and unfinished, and more real than anything he'd felt in 15 years of building an empire on the deliberate management of everything he let himself feel. He didn't know exactly what came next. He knew the framework. He knew Thursday. He knew Father Domingo's coffee on Sunday morning, and Carla's calls, and Marco's updates, and the slow structural dismantling of everything Roberto had built inside his walls. He knew that somewhere across the city, a woman was working on a laptop in a moving car, rebuilding herself one careful plan at a time. And he knew with the same certainty he brought to everything that mattered, the certainty he'd learned to trust when it arrived clean and unfiltered, and immune to second-guessing that whatever they were building together had already become the most important thing he'd ever put his name to. That was enough. That was, for now, everything.